main gate entrance. Welcome to the great place, Fort Hood. Its greatness stretches for 340 square miles, from the populated main cantonment of Fort Hood, with its war-themed roads of Battalion Avenue, Hell on Wheels, Tank Destroyer, to its vast stretches of pitted firing ranges, the targets wavering with heat in the distance, soldiers slumped beneath the insufficient shade of tent netting, sipping from hot canteens. These ranges are notorious for being halted by cattle. Gates surround Hood, manned by men and women with firearms, who check all vehicles and turn away anyone who does not have the proper identification. But Texas law will not banish the cows of neighboring farms from roaming the firing ranges, and soldiers wait hours and hours for the muscled, long-horned beasts to make their way out of the sight of their guns. Fort Hood, like most Army bases, has stern-faced offices with tiny windows, square apartment buildings, and barracks with their crooked air conditioners and metal stairways, everything industrial in the ugliest way, with few architectural flourishes or decoration. Different bases might have different building materials, red brick versus gray concrete, depending on the wartime era of their construction, but it's always clear that no matter how much money Congress allotted for the Army budget, most of it went into the fighting machines rather than the buildings. When the soldiers deployed, when the 18,000 soldiers of the 1st Cav Division went to Iraq, the base shifted from a world dominated by camouflage uniforms to one of brightly colored baby carriages and diaper bags, mommy and me meetings at the 1st Cav Museum, women on picnic blankets lounging on the parade field. Though a division of soldiers was far away, the retreat still sounded at 5 o'clock each evening, blared through speakers across the entire base, and the women stopped their moving cars and got out, stood in the streets with their hands over their hearts, facing the flag just as their husbands would have done, until the bugle song was over. Wives with lawns quickly learned how to mow them or hire the neighbor's teenage son, lest they get a military police citation for letting the grass grow too long. The spouses admired each other's flower beds, the unit crest banners they hung over their name-tagged doors, the small American flags that they pressed into the edges of the driveways, the yellow ribbons they tied around out front. They shopped together, shared leftovers, watched each other's kids so they could go to the gym. They attended church and Bible study, baked brownies and mailed them to soldiers, washed cars to raise money for school supplies for Afghani and Iraqi children. The women tried to reach out to Natalia. They really did. They invited her to playgroups and luncheons and teas. They offered to babysit her children so she could take a break. And all along, they were afraid of her. They knew she could happen to any of them. She could be the girl cutting their husband's hair right now in Baghdad, shipped in from some economically devastated country, young and lovely and, for goodness sake, a woman in that place of men. Who wouldn't fall in love with such a girl when he was so far from home and so close to death? A woman's soft hands along the short ridge of his hair, on his sunburned neck, holding the mirror up for him to see, his reflection next to hers. But Natalia never accepted their invitations. With her dog Boris tugging her wildly, she walked around Hood in that coat you could spot a mile away, her earrings glinting, her lips perfectly painted, making all the other wives assess their figures in the mirror or tug at their shirts self-consciously, touching their hair, rubbing powder into their sweat-shiny faces, knowing it was no use. This was what they knew and whispered about Natalia. She didn't bake or make posters. She never offered to wash a car. She didn't take her children to any of the parks on post. She shopped at the commissary and filled her cart with odd foods, cabbage and onions and potatoes, sometimes chocolate milk, but never anything nutritious enough to feed a pair of 3-year-olds. She went out a few nights a week, dressed to cause a scandal, high heels, plenty of rouge, earrings long enough to touch her collarbones. She went out alone, and if the wives met her on the stairs and tried to ask her where she was headed at 10 o'clock at night, she'd smile as if she didn't understand the question and continue tottering down to the parking lot below. No one ever saw a babysitter enter her apartment, even though plenty of wives had volunteered, eager to get a look at the interior of her home and fridge. They had all seen Natalia lock the door behind her when she went out, and they all imagined Natalia's twins inside with the television on, alone, the apartment's sharp corners waiting for their soft heads. But no one ever called family services. One night there was a knock on Meg's door. Natalia stood outside, moving from foot to foot as if her high heels hurt her. For a moment, Meg thought Natalia was going to ask her to go out with her, that they would go to some underground Serbian bar and drink vodka martinis while strange men watched them from the shadows. Instead, Natalia handed Meg 3 crumpled $20 bills. Meg took the money and waited, hesitating, but Natalia just stared as if she wanted a receipt for the money she owed Meg. She was wearing an orange lipstick that made her cheeks gray. Meg smiled through her disappointment and said softly, "I could watch your kids for you. I only work days, and I could watch them at night. That way they wouldn't be alone, in case something happened." The skin of Natalia's pale neck turned red, but Meg couldn't tell if it was anger or embarrassment. "A woman must go out sometimes, yes," Natalia asked softly. "Husbands do not understand. Babies sleep, nothing will happen. It's common in my country. We do not worry so much." Meg folded the money into her back pocket. "Still, I could watch them." "Perhaps," Natalia said, lifting her shoulders slightly in annoyed acquiescence. Before Meg could nod in reply, Natalia turned and walked away. Meg dreamt of ghost alarm clocks ringing, her husband slipping free of a blanket and letting cold air whisper over her legs. Then his kiss by her ear turned into a loud bark. She sat up in her bed and glanced at her clock. It was 1:23 a.m. Her vigilance had failed her. She had dozed off. She went to get a glass of water and to listen all the better, for she had happened upon a spot in the kitchen wall the size of a fist that a long-ago tenant must have punched and then plastered up badly. When Meg put her ear against that papery area, she swore she could hear Natalia breathe. She quickly stepped back. A man's voice was audible just a few inches away, speaking low as if he had been told to whisper, as if he knew that Meg's ear was pressed close. Knives scraped plates, and liquid was poured into glasses. There was a long silence, and then Natalia started to speak, almost whimpering. Then footsteps were leaving the kitchen, and Natalia's front door opened. Meg looked around her own apartment quickly, grabbed her garbage, and dragged it into the hall, hoping to catch a glimpse of the stranger. But she only saw Natalia in her doorway, her hand pressed to her throat, her face devoid of makeup, as pale as the fluorescent light overhead. Their eyes met, and Meg looked away.